Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion, it's not a straightforward review, it's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up with me on Twitter, you can find me at ILTM Podcast. I'm also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, and we have a Patreon. That's at patreon.com/. I Love That Movie. The show is always free, but if you want to support us on there, you can. And I want to take a moment to thank my top patrons. They are Chris Belga, Michael Cross, Philip Barker, and Ricardo Alvarez. And if you do sign up, you get a weekly bonus episode where I kind of run over the stuff that I'm watching that week. And right now, we have guests every week talking about each episode of The Mandalorian. So we have a lot of fun on there. And lastly, guys, if you like what you heard today, please subscribe and rate the show. It does help new listeners find us. Well, I've got a new guest on the podcast today. I've got Dallin, the critic. Say hi.
Hi, thank you for having me, Lisa.
Yeah, and can you introduce yourself a little bit since this is your first time on the podcast?
I'm a film critic. I've been writing movie reviews semi-professionally for about 5 years now. I just have such a love for film overall, and I'm glad to be here today.
Great. Okay, well, Dallin, thank you for coming on. I was reading your review on Wonder Woman today. Um, and so, yeah, people should go check out your blog, and we'll mention that at the end of the podcast, too. Uh, I, so my guests always pick the movie. So, what movie did you choose to talk about today?
I chose to talk about the latest of the Planet of the Apes films that came out about 4 years now. Really, 4 years? Jeez.
I
Uh,
know.
so long and so yet so short. And that is War for the Planet of the Apes.
Yes. So we've only covered, I went back and looked through my catalog, and we've covered Planet of the Apes, like the original movie, and that's it. So we haven't covered any of the new trilogy. And so I was really excited that you picked this one. You actually picked the final installment of the trilogy, like you said, War for the Planet of the Apes, which came out in 2017. So almost 5 years ago. Um, and yeah, or 4 years ago. You're right. Let me say it again. And you picked the third installment, War for the Planet of the Apes, which came out in 2017. So yeah, 4 years ago. I'm excited to talk about this one. I love this trilogy, and I'm shocked no one's picked it yet. So excited to dive in. Now, before we keep going, I do want to warn new listeners that this is not going to be spoiler free. We are going to talk spoilers. So if you do want to go watch this first, you can. I rented it today on iTunes, but you can, rent it wherever, Vudu, wherever you rent movies, and come back and then join us. So I'm going to read the synopsis really quick, and then we'll kind of dive into your history with the movie and stuff like that. Here we go. Caesar and his apes are forced into a deadly conflict with the army of humans led by the ruthless Colonel, played by Woody Harrelson. After the apes suffer unimaginable losses, Caesar wrestles with his darker instincts and begins his own mythic quest to avenge his kind. As the journey finally brings them face to face, Caesar and the Colonel are pitted against each other in an epic battle that will determine the fate of both their species and the future of the planet. Well, it doesn't get much bigger in scope than that. It's a pretty big plot, right?
Yeah. Although when you think about it, all these films, at least as far as this trilogy goes, they have really broad premises, but their stories are so small when you think about it, so character centric.
I think you're absolutely right. It's like the fate of the planet is at stake, but yet the story itself feels so personal. I'm assuming that when you saw this movie, you saw it in theaters?
I did, and I actually have quite a funny story to tell.
Oh, go for
Um,
it.
so before this movie came out, I guess I knew nothing about the Planet of the Apes movies.
Really?
Yeah, I hadn't seen the '68 film or any of its sequels. Um, I guess I saw the Tim Burton reboot, which what a way to start out the franchise was seeing that one.
You're like, oh, okay, I don't like these then. And sorry, Jared, if you're listening, I know you do like that movie, and eventually we will cover it. I'm not hating on you.
Yeah, but I actually didn't see any of the other films until leading up to this. So about a few days before I saw this one in theaters, I watched the original '68 film, which I liked fine. Not one of my favorites, and I think a lot of it hinges on a twist that, because of where I'm at in my generation, was spoiled to me pretty much by the notion of having prequels and growing up during a time when those were coming out. Still a very good movie with great discussions about faith and reasoning. I enjoy it, but I actually didn't see the predecessors to War, Rise and Dawn, until I actually saw this movie in the theaters. I saw it
Oh,
uh,
wow.
as a triple feature, if you will.
Dang, that's a lot of movies at once that you
It is.
haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I guess the idea was that the this new film was coming out about 2 days in advance for this event, and so I did it not only to have the opportunity to get a review out in advance. I was really my first opportunity to do that sort of thing, you know, kind of have a jump ahead on the rest of the world. But I actually saw this. I went to this event. It was my brother's birthday. So, James, if you're listening, thank you. I'm eternally grateful that you allowed me to do this uh, on your birthday. At the time, I felt like such a jerk for abandoning my brother, but I'm glad I did this. And the part about this whole thing is that, you know, when you think they're holding these kind of events, that, you know, there'd be a big crowd, and I remember everyone talking about the last two uh, Apes movies, and so I figured there'd be a big turnout for this. There was no turnout.
Wow.
Only one there to sit through all three of those
Oh
movies.
my gosh. This trilogy is underrated. I was thinking about that a lot today, that I think that these movies don't have maybe the spectacle that people are expecting when they see them. They're kind of, I mean, not to sound pretentious, but they're kind of thinking films, it's they're broad concepts, and even though there are personal stories, but it's like, yes, there's some fighting, there's some explosions, but a lot of it is like just thinking really about what's going on. And there's a lot of themes and references to history, religion, if you're into that, which I am, I you really enjoy these films, but I don't know that they're big popcorn crowd pleasers. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I completely agree. In fact, I
Yeah,
refer to this trilogy of films as kind of like the anti-summer blockbuster.
pretty much. I mean, they're done so well, but it's like kind of a hard sell for people. Like I love them, but and some of my friends really love them, but other friends are like, "Oh yeah, maybe I'll sit through that someday." But they're not like eager to go out and see this. So on some level, I'm not surprised that your theater wasn't packed, but to hear it was empty is kind of sad.
Well, I expected that, oh, it's a triple feature. Obviously, people are not going to sit through movies they've already seen. So I thought
Mhm.
people were going to like sneak in right as the third one would be coming along. No, not true. And
Gosh.
the reason why I'll always remember being the only one there is that, you know, for these events, they kind of give out like collectibles. So they handed out a poster, which I have, you can't see it, but I have hanging behind me on my wall.
Nice.
That poster. But they also had like a collectible ticket, and they number these tickets. So I was one out of 100 people that could have received one of those things.
Oh my gosh.
I was the only one, so I felt kind of special, but I
Yeah.
also felt lonely. Uh,
Yeah, I would 1 is the loneliest number, I mean, yeah.
I felt like Lego Batman sitting alone in his theater in that movie. Hindsight being 2020, I should have probably invited some people to go with me. Uh, but then again, part of why I consider it such a special experience was because I was alone.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's probably, because it is kind of a big plot and there's a lot going on, maybe it is better to watch alone, I don't know. I saw it in theaters. I saw all of them in theaters. I wouldn't call myself, like, a huge Planet of the Apes fan. I think more so now than when I was younger. I remember my parents, it being on the TV and them watching it a lot, like a lot of the old sequels more than the original. And I know I saw the original at some point when I was a kid, but I didn't really go back and seriously watch them until I was an adult. And I love the original one a lot. Um, and I like this movie because, I mean, they all lead up to that movie, but this one really does. It's where we start to finally see the progression into the Planet of the Apes. And I don't think my theater was empty, but I don't remember it being crowded either. So I was somewhere in between. I didn't see it early. I think I just honestly, like, before I did this podcast, I didn't really, like, always rush out to see movies like the day they came out or anything like that. I would be like, unless it was like a really, really big one, and this one wasn't quite that big for me. Nowadays, I probably, once we start getting back to theaters more, I probably would. But yeah, at the time, I just remember seeing it like on a Friday or Saturday night with some friends. And I don't remember it being too terribly eventful, but I did really, really enjoy it. Um, the next thing I want to do is run over a couple of quick facts that I had written down about the film. The first one being that according to Matt Reeves, the name of the group of rebelling humans are the Alpha and Omega, a reference to the bomb the mutants worshipped in Beneath the Planet of the Apes in 1970. The logo on their helmets and flag matches the original logo on the bomb. So
huh.
yeah, I haven't seen all the Planet of the Apes sequels. Like, I've seen them as in they were on in the background, but I haven't sat down and watched all of them. So I didn't get that reference, but I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I remember at the time I too tried watching all the sequels, but I started watching Beneath and I couldn't get through it. I just couldn't get through it. I may try to watch those movies at some point, and I saw bits and pieces as they were airing around the clock on cable networks. But from what I saw, I was like, I'll just stick with the original of this trilogy of films for now.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat. According to Matt Reeves, it was actually Woody Harrelson's idea to begin addressing Caesar by listing the military rivals of the past. Um, Wellington, Napoleon, Grant, Lee, Custer, and Sitting Bull, while noting that as an ape, Caesar would not know what he was talking about.
Huh.
And I thought that was cool. And he even says that at the end of it. He's like, you don't really know, your namesake. And it's like, I guess we forget, like, Caesar has the ability to know that, but because he's basically, like, been on the run this entire time, like, he hasn't had time to delve into, like, the meaning behind his name. So that's a pretty cool fact. The last one that I had was that Matt Reeves said, point of view is one of the most important things that you use in a story. That's a quote. Adding that while this summer blockbuster, whose spectacle is something different than superpowers or a grand action sequence, he said, our spectacle is that by the end of the movie, you're an ape. Viewers end up identifying with the emotional beats expressed by the apes.
I say that's a very accurate statement on his part.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself at the end of this movie thinking, yeah, I mean, I'm on their side. I'm seeing everything from their point of view, although I think the apes in general in this trilogy, I mean, they're really a stand in for us and how I think just how humanity evolved and how we end up replaying those same beats no matter what. I think it's a theme even in this one that by the end of the movie, I don't know that I necessarily think the apes are like quote unquote better than people, because in some ways they're heading in the same direction, but certainly I'm seeing things from their perspective, and they're definitely the heroes of the story by the end.
Yeah, I remember watching the '68 film and thinking, okay, so this new trilogy, how does it fit in? I kind of wondered its place. And the other interesting experience that I had was trying to root for these apes to begin with, because the way that the original is framed, it's very much that you root for the Charlton Heston character. I forget his name. But
Yeah.
now the apes are sort of the heroes of the story. And at first it was kind of like, okay, how are they gonna convince me to root for them? And then I sat through the first one and was like, okay, yep, totally get it. I'm on board. Let's do this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think, at first when they announced this trilogy, and that it was gonna be a prequel, I mean, honestly, I thought, "Where can this go?" You know? Oh, and the name of the character from the original was George Taylor. Um,
Ah,
but I like you, I think of just Charlton Heston. I mean, he's so Charlton Heston that, he couldn't have been anybody else, right? But, yeah, I thought, "Well, what more is there to say?" I think because we got so used to everything being after the 1968 film being in the future, this going back into the past. But, yeah, by the first one that I saw in theaters, I was like, "Wow, this is, like, really good. I like where it's headed." And then by this movie, I mean, I just think it's, like, the perfect end cap that leads directly into that original film. And in the original film, you're right. It's more from the perspective of George, but at the same time, by the end of the movie, there's of course that big twist. Spoilers that they're on Earth, and that it's all our fault. And so he has that moment of like, you know, he was angry at these apes the whole movie, but really like we brought this about, or he can tell that we did. It's the fall of mankind. And this movie, this trilogy, like really fleshes that idea out and proves that there's so much more story to tell. And I don't know, I love it. I I don't know how I rank them, to be honest. Like that first one is so nostalgic for me, but the original, but I mean, this trilogy is why the second that the Batman was announced, I had like zero problems. Like I was like, whatever, it's gonna be amazing. I know it is because these movies were.
oh, definitely. I was the
Yeah.
same case. It's like even when Robert Pattinson was cast, it was like, hey, it has Matt Reeves' name on it. I'm sold. That's all I need. You know.
Yeah, and he
But I
made the
guess
last 2 movies, but, I mean, I think they're even stronger than the first movie, so, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess Andy Serkis is going to be Alfred in that movie, so I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
totally down.
Yes, and Andy Serkis in this film is truly incredible. I was watching some behind the scenes before we were recording, um, and I don't know, because the movie is so seamless, it looks so beautiful, the effects in this movie are so great, I, like, almost forget that it's people wearing suits with little dots all over their faces. I mean, that's gotta be tough to act around. I mean, Andy Serkis has a lot of practice, obviously, more than most actors, but it's just really incredible, like, how seamless that ends up being and the performances that the apes give in the movie.
Oh yeah, and the fact that they're able to ride horses in that equipment, most of the
Yeah, I didn't even
movie,
think about that.
like that, and the fact that the horses still behaved the way that they wanted them to during that movie, even with all the suits that they were wearing, which I imagine because of all the dots and markers that they have to put on the suit, I imagine that's not comfortable. So
Those suits don't look
both for the
comfortable,
actors
no.
and the animals that they pulled that off is just amazing in and of itself.
Yeah, it's incredible that we're at a point with special effects that you can have these movies. I mean, by this movie, it's predominantly apes, that we're following, and you never feel like you're watching like a cartoon, or the effects never distract from the movie at all. Um,
Oh,
oh, go ahead.
I'd go I'd go one step further and say that they don't feel like effects. They feel like makeup. Like I
Yes,
remember watching this movie, which was the first time I'd watched it in a while. Although I love the movie, I hadn't seen it in a while. And I was looking at the Caesar character. I'm like, that's Andy Serkis's face with makeup, right? Like I know people say that to prove that CGI is so good, but I actually thought for a second that he was just in a ape suit with very convincing makeup on.
Yeah, I mean it looks like him, but it doesn't, and it does look like makeup. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's pretty incredible. And for them to be able to keep your, he's the front of the poster and you see him most of the movie and you interact such close-up shots of all these apes and gorillas that, if they didn't look as good as they do, it could be distracting, but it really is not. If anything, it adds to it. Like you said, they look like suits. Like it gives that feeling of the original. Um the next I kind of wanted to talk about some of your favorite scenes. So what are some of your favorite scenes from this movie?
So I remember watching this movie for the first time and being hooked right out of the gate. I'd
Yeah.
just come up of Dawn, and fortunately, I didn't have to wait 3 years to see the next chapter. It was more like 30 minutes.
Right.
Uh, but the scene where you have the first real confrontation between Caesar and the Colonel up in his quarters. That
Yeah.
scene gave me the chills. Um, just to see, I think that's probably my favorite Andy Serkis moment. Like he's done a lot of great work as Gollum and King Kong, and he's done a lot of these other mocap roles and on-screen roles. I enjoy him as Claw in the Black Panther movie, but as far as like pure acting moment goes, that was the moment I was like, okay, get this man an award or something. Like that is acting right there. That the pure emotion that he shows, and Woody Harrelson isn't too shabby either. Like I had mostly known him for comedy when I saw
Right.
this, not anything really drama related, and I was like, this has to be his twin brother, right? This can't be him. The Zombieland guy, the Hunger Games guy, is this really him? It's him, all right. And I was floored. That was the moment where I was like, okay, yep, this is my favorite movie of the year,
Yeah, he's such
instantly.
an incredible and compelling bad guy. Like, I mean, the way he's written too, I think, he's one of those bad guys that it's not like I think he's right, but I can see how he got there and it makes him even more frightening. I think when bad guys have a rhyme and reason that kind of makes sense, they're just that much more dangerous. And this confrontation between the two of them, I mean, by this point in the movie, he's wiped out his wife and one of his sons, Blue Eyes, and a bunch of people or a bunch of apes. And so this is like his moment. I mean, he came all this way to confront him. That was his complete goal here. And so, yeah, this moment is great because the squaring off between the two of them is just awesome.
And I think that he believes that his cause is righteous is what scares me the most about these kind of villains, is
Yes.
that they hide and shield their motives behind some religious subtext. That
Hmm.
what they're doing, that their cause is not only justified morally but religiously. And I just found that absolutely terrifying. I know he's not like outwardly he's not one of the scariest villains you'll meet, but when you look inwardly and you see those scenes between him and Caesar, you're just like, what is this guy gonna do next? Like he seems unhinged not only mentally, but he seems like he's gonna, start killing apes any minute now.
Hmm.
And he always has you on edge, waiting for what is going to happen next to these characters that we've grown to care about for 2.5 movies now.
Agreed. And another dark part about him as a villain is that he has a level of clarity on the gravity of what humanity is facing that everyone else doesn't have yet. So what's kind of scary too is that he's right in that this is going to be what wipes out the human race essentially. Like at the very least it's going to make them, you know, regress. And at this point in the movie, he and his group, they're like extremists and the US government is actually after them. They find out later in the film humanity is not on Woody Harrelson's side, but he feels like, this is our last stand. Like, this is it. If I don't kill every person that's been infected by the virus, then humanity will not continue on. And we, as the audience, having seen the 1968 version, actually know that he's right. But
Yeah,
that kind of adds a level of weirdness to it too, because it's like the rest of humanity is like, we couldn't do that, but it's like it literally, this will happen, and he is actually right. But like you said, the way he gets there, the justification, being able to, without hesitation, eliminate his son, and even that level of being like, well, he was not useful anymore because he regressed and can't speak. I mean, that's terrible. That just sounds, that's awful. That's just genocide. So yeah, all that stuff makes it super dark. And to be honest, today I was watching like a clip that was just explaining the, I think it's called the simian flu in the movies. It was just talking about that specific aspect of these films, and it was giving me kind of weird vibes because they played a
yeah,
clip from one of the films that was like, "Stay home, if you're not feeling well, stay home. Don't spread the virus." And I was like, "Oh God, like I don't know if I should be watching this clip right now." Um, but it's also such a brilliant way to explain what happens in the 68 film. And then, of course, I don't want to jump too far ahead, so I'll just say this. The twist towards the end of this movie, I freaking love with Woody Harrelson's character, but we'll get there, I'm sure. So just wanted to get that in.
yeah. Just one more thing about that scene. The way he says everything about how he came to know about the virus's true nature. First my son stopped talking, and the doctor that treated him stopped talking, and then the guy that theorized this hypothesis stopped talking. It's just as he keeps going, it's like, oh no, how many men did he kill? How
Right.
many? What has he done? What is the full extent of his villainy? And even more so, I wrote this line down, but he has this kind of moment where he's scared because this virus is not killing them, but by, quote, robbing them of the things that make them humans. And I found that statement very powerful because he delivers it so well, but kind of ironic that he views intelligence and, quote, higher thinking as what makes human human when you have these apes over here that show true humanity through real empathy. I thought that kind of unspoken irony just made him even more engaging as a character.
100%. And like you're saying, number one, it's flawed logic, because by that logic, he should be treating the apes like humans and treating some of the humans as less than. But then also it's dark because I think it mirrors some of our own history of people feeling empowered to subjugate others or kill others by putting them in a category that makes them less than themselves, and elevating themselves and the qualities that they feel that they have as superior. Um, Everything about that is messed up.
Yeah,
It's terrible.
exactly.
Yeah.
Everything about, all the derogatory names that they have for the apes. King Kong is repeated. The apes that work with them or work under them are called donkeys. Just they do everything they can to belittle this coexisting race that's just trying to live to survive, really. It's just horrifying to watch. And that he, tells his whole methodology in front of one of the main soldiers in the film. And the soldier is phased by it, but doesn't do anything because he knows what he will do if he acts in a way that the colonel doesn't approve of. It just shows the amount of control he has over his men.
Right,
It's
and
it's
yeah, I
amazing.
think ultimately he acts like he's got this really noble reason saving the human race, but ultimately it does feel like it's all about him and his control over people more than it is about anything else. Like, at least for most of the film, he's enjoying just being at the very top. And I think there's a lot of, like you said, labels in the film, like you said, the donkeys or gorillas, just ways to label different groups so that they then become other and that you don't have to empathize or, for lack of a better term, I know they're apes, but humanize them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And gosh, I had a thought here. Um, one more thing about that scene is how he, I guess, if you want to think about it in a slightly more humorous way, you brought up how the whole flu virus thing feels scarily real. His obsession with burning everything kind of makes him the ultimate germaphobe.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. It's kind of
Yeah,
like he's vaguely aware of how it spreads, and so that is probably part of why he does burns everything because he thinks, and it kind of doesn't it give you sort of like the thing vibes a little bit too, like burning stuff as a method of getting rid of whatever it is that's spreading.
yeah. And I guess you could look at him as like the extreme version of what we see today. You know, people scared of the virus. You know, he's like the worst you can get. So, um,
Yeah.
you know, you can't. You'd have to do some pretty dark stuff to hit hit that level.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. One thing that I really like in the movie is the introduction of the little girl character, Nova. Um,
Yeah,
when the way that they set it up is perfect. It's sort of it's different than the 1968 film. In that one, there's sort of like a love interest, and she's mute and stuff. In this case, Caesar just lost his family, and he's just, I mean, the rage and the revenge, that's just taken over, and he's starting to become brutal in a way that he wasn't in previous films. And he happens upon a soldier who tells him, like, I'm going to put the gun down, and he just shoots him, and kills him. And the other apes kind of react to that. They're kind of like, this isn't how you normally operate. Like, that was weird. And then they go into the house, and he goes in there, like, guns blazing. He's ready to take more people out. He's just hurt and angry and in pain. And then he sees the little girl. And I think I like the way they did that because I think it really sets in for him that, like, this was bad. Like, he killed this child's father essentially. And he, as a parent himself, it really touches him. And then they end up taking this little girl with them, and she is like the first sign that people can't speak, right? I think she's like the first human we encounter that can't
yeah.
talk.
I think that's correct. And what's interesting about her introduction is that Caesar, you're right. He's ready to go in there, guns a blazing, you know, ready to tear the place apart and get whatever he needs to continue on his mission. And then he finds the little girl, and he looks at her. You kind of see on his face his disgust in himself at killing, you know, his father, caretaker, whoever it was that was helping her. Uh, and he kind of just brushes her aside because he is so consumed by hate. And then you have Maurice, the
Hmm.
orangutan, who really takes to her. And I don't know if this is maybe because he did so well in Dawn, but I feel like if Matt Reeves, like if this was his only Apes film, I don't know that some of the interactions that some of the apes have with Nova would have actually made it to the final cut. When you think about it, that they're actually really essential to the story, but you can kind of see like some studios that exec going, maybe trim these sequences down. And I
Yeah,
think that
that's
would have been a
true.
mistake. That because those moments humanize the characters that we already know, and they go and show who she is as a person, who's just really innocent and really trying to make sense of things that really don't make sense. But you added an interesting point in that when Caesar sees her, uh, sorry, when Caesar sees her, she kind of reacts to him uh, in a scared way. But I think she really takes to him, even though he's not really the most approachable character. And what I like about this
Yeah.
scene most is that right after she's introduced, they bring her with her. There's that small moment where he's trying to drink water. He's nervous because Nova is right next to her. Uh, and the fact that he realizes he just killed the caretaker or her father, um, kind of he sees that disgust in himself and looks at her as kind of like the representation of his humanity. And after that moment, he gets nervous, and then that's the first hallucination he has of Koba, the ape from the last film that he killed.
Right.
Uh, I like how that all ties together. It all connects. It's very tight for like a 2.5 hour movie.
I agree. And Nova kind of represents Caesar when we met him in the first movie because he went from being a regular ape to gaining this level of intelligence. And at the beginning of that movie, even when he's very intelligent, he's extremely innocent. He doesn't understand why humans don't like him. And he evolves into who he is at the end of this movie. And I think she kind of represents where he started. And I think some of the apes that like at this point in the story, like all the apes started as regular apes, and then they haven't, they're not like second generation apes with that level of intelligence. They remember um a before, and so I think maybe that makes them more sympathetic to Nova, who is now kind of in their place, and so they're kind of like, how can I be cruel to somebody who is so innocent and so naive when that was me not too long ago.
Yeah, and that he really does try to understand where the other apes are coming from, as far as like their attachment to her. But I think you really see that relationship between them grow uh, throughout the film, especially in that one scene where she kind of sneaks into the camp and feeds Caesar and gives him water,
Oh,
and
yeah.
really becomes, you know, in his favor. Not only in his favor, but he kind of takes her on as like a child of his own.
I'm gonna
You can
sound
see that connection.
Oh, for sure. I'm gonna sound like one of my guests that I've had on here before, but there's some, pretty obvious Bible analogies in this one. Caesar's a lot like Moses, leading his people away from the oppressors. But also, I think in that scene where she brings him that water and food, it's sort of like a Christ analogy, a little bit too.
Yeah.
you know.
Also, there's
Uh,
like hints of Spartacus throughout this film.
oh, for
Uh,
sure, for
yeah,
sure. Yeah. A lot of like history, religion. I mean, things that we can relate to. And I completely agree with what you were saying about Nova being sort of like the vehicle that the audience is able to more deeply empathize with the apes. And, maybe Matt Reeves and his team were like, hey, we've got to figure out a way to make sure that, yes, this movie is we're going to end up at the very end being empathetic and close to the apes. And we're championing their struggle, not the humans, but I think that Nova is a good way to, she's our in, because the way that they view her kind of makes it to where it's like they're not necessarily mad at all humans as a whole. They're mad at the humans that they're fighting, but they can sort of imagine a future where they're not angry at humans because of the Nova character.
yeah, you're right
Yeah.
about the whole viewpoint for the audience, because I think if you don't have a character that has any redeemable qualities, I mean, who are you going to root for? The people that put apes into camps and you know stand in formation as they listen to the national anthem being played, or
Yeah.
this little girl who you very much seems like a child who
Hmm.
also conveys a sense of maturity that I think on a deeper level the apes kind of respect, particularly the Maurice character.
Yeah, and her emotional capacity, even though she's maybe, you know, somewhat regressed, as they keep saying. We don't really know what level that is. We just know she can't speak. But it's implied in the movie that it's not just them being able to speak. And I think that goes back to, I think, the first movie, because the whole point of creating that um this cure was to help somebody with Alzheimer's. And so I guess the virus has mutated to a point where it's sort of doing that to people, like giving them that permanently, and that's causing them to have mental decline, not just not be able to talk, which would not be necessarily a sign, right? Um,
Yeah,
but with her, even though she has this quote unquote decline, she has the emotional maturity and ability that it seems like the regular humans lack. So, yeah, I think that that's what they really respect about her, especially that scene where, not Maurice, but was it Rocket? Which he
Luca.
passes away. Luca, that's right. Okay, thank you. When Luca passes away, Luca had given her those flowers in her hair, and then later she, in turns, puts them on him and cries. And I like the way that Caesar looks at her when she's crying, because he sees that she's truly feeling grief for Luca. She really had a connection with that ape. So yeah, I think that's he's like, okay, like some people are good, and then ironically, the other humans are labeling these people as like less than, and yet they seem to have more empathy than they do. So in some ways,
Yeah,
like they're more advanced, and like the regular people, it's almost like the more intelligent you are, the less empathetic you are, or something.
yeah. It's interesting that you bring that up because these movies have always been like a reflection of like humanity and their overconfidence. This whole
Mm-hmm.
idea that this disease is carried about because of man's own ignorance to cure what can't be cured, ironically ends up, being another ultimate disease to the rest of the world.
Right.
Even those who didn't ask for it are affected by it. And it's, I guess, I don't know. I haven't seen these other movies, the older movies, but I wonder if there's something in them where you kind of see uh, a more human point of view. I always kind of wonder, like, if there was a movie in this series that focused on humans and as they were in the midst of this all breaking out. I guess we don't need it because we're living in it, but
It feels like we are. Um,
but I guess
yeah.
from a character standpoint, like it's interesting to see these people react to it. You don't see that much here. Not that that's a slight against the film, but I mean, considering they're all military soldiers, they're not supposed to show emotion. In fact, there's multiple banners throughout this film of like, show courage, not fear, keep it to yourself, trying to
Mhm.
suppress emotion. They're basically like, Vulcans, angry Vulcans.
Yeah, they're trying not to experience the gravity of what's actually happening and only focus on their mission. And I think also that makes it easier for us to distance ourselves from the humans in the film, because it's kind of like, like in sci-fi movies or like Star Wars or something where, all you see a bunch of people get shot, but you're like, eh, because they're like all wearing like stormtrooper outfits. You know what I mean? It's kind of like
Yeah,
that, where it's like that uniform creates a little bit of distance, I think. Because they're not all just like regular people. They're like, you know, they're all armed, they're trained, and they're, like you said, not showing any emotion. So, um, I
yeah.
think
It
that
almost
that
doesn't
allows
matter.
distance. Yeah.
Yeah, it almost doesn't matter who they are, like whether even see their face or not. They're just so committed to a cause that is so not right, but again, the fact that they believe in it so much, or at least are
Mhm.
forced to believe in it, are very scary ideas indeed.
Yeah, exactly. What's another scene that you like? I feel like I kind of went off on a tangent.
Oh, no problem. I guess the I mentioned the scene where Caesar gets food and water from Nova.
Mhm.
Um, that scene kind of like that was another moment where I was like, yeah, yeah, I'm definitely enjoying this. Also, it's interesting to that you bring up the kind of Christ similarities because I think you're onto something there. Even in his introduction in this film, you have him passing through the wounded and the deceased in his introduction, and they're like wanting to touch his hand. There's a lot
Yes.
of that, a religious context. Also, that you bring up Moses when Charlton Heston played Moses once. It all ties together.
It does. And also like the avalanche scene is sort of like the parting of the Red Sea, because it's like, that was like in the Bible that's like an act of God, but in this movie he, sets off that oil thing or whatever, and it explodes. So in some ways he made that happen, but in another way it's kind of like it looks like nature coming for them. Like it puts them in a position of being like the good guys, like sort of like God or something is intervening and saving them almost. At least
Yeah,
it visually it kind of looks like that. And I can't claim all the credit for that. I was watching some videos that were explaining that too. But definitely picked up on some of that even before I watched it. But if you have the time to go back and like, watch some kind of deep dives, they'll like point out a lot of parallels. And I'm like, yeah, I can totally see that. And it sort of like creates this mystique around Caesar that it feels like after he's gone, he will sort of be like like there'll be some sort of story written about, their deliverance and the significance that he played and how he becomes by the end almost like, I mean, just a mythical person, like he just
yeah,
becomes so important by the end, and people, like you said, or apes are like awed by his presence, and look to him for every single decision.
yeah. I'll again that you bring up the avalanche one. I'm sorry, I kind of piggybacking off your thoughts,
Oh,
but
go for it.
I always interpreted that last destruction as a result of their own folly.
True,
I think
very
during the
true.
the battle, you see a lot of helicopters and what have you crashing into the mountainside. I think that played a part in that, and I think the gas explosion was the last thing that set it off. But you can't really blame Caesar for it because there
Mm,
wouldn't been need for a gas explosion if there wasn't a war going on.
that's true.
Uh,
So it's truly like, you know, and earlier in the film, Woody Harrelson mentions that like he goes, "Well, I think Caesar says like, who's coming?" Like, it occurs to him like, "Oh, this is like I'm in the middle of like their war. Like I think we're just fighting them, but actually they're fighting someone else." And he's like, "Everybody." So it like wipes pretty much maybe the whole human race out in that
yeah,
scene. Like it is truly the end of humanity. Um, Towards the end, and you're right, it is, you can point to a couple things that Caesar played a part in, but really it's like the problem kind of took care of itself. Like people
yeah,
just self-destructed to the point where they were free.
yeah. I remember the thought I had, watching this again was like, okay, so after this avalanche passes over them, how many humans are left? Kind of make you wonder. Like, I guess
Yeah.
that's the point because of where we end up in the '68 film, where they're very sparse. They're very they're very much spread throughout the globe. They're not as prevalent as they once were. Uh,
Right, and I
and
don't know what the timeline is, like, how soon after this would that be? Or, you know, uh, like, in other words, are they like second, third generation of people that have no idea that that happened, or you know what I mean?
I think it's closer because Caesar's second son is Cornelius, and
That's
Cornelius is a
true.
character in the '68 film,
My
and
favorite
that you
one.
have Nova. Although I don't like the idea that Nova, this little girl, goes into the Nova from the '68 film. They seem like two different characters in my mind, at least.
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree. I think it's more of maybe like an Easter egg, but I think
yeah,
you're right about the timeline because I saw another like sort of, explanation that I forgot about, but in Rise of the Planet of the Apes, there's like a newspaper, and then I think there's also like a news broadcast that talks about the mission to Mars that starts the 68 film.
yeah, and
So that it can't be too much longer after this one then.
yeah. I'd have to go back and see the film, but I think they kind of date how long the journey was going to last for.
Ah.
Uh, so perhaps if, I'll go back and find out what the exact date was, but I think they said like something 60, 50 years maybe. I don't know.
So maybe enough for like possibly another generation, but not too far into the future. Okay.
Yeah, because Rise
Yeah.
is like the opening of that film starts in present day, and then
Mhm.
passes like 5 years later, and then another 10 go by in Dawn, and then this is like wars like I think another 6 years or maybe shorter. I forget like the timeline of it all, but maybe that's kind of feasible that they come in soon after like the apes settle in their new homeland. Wouldn't be an unreasonable thought. I actually wonder
Yeah.
if this journey actually takes longer than um, the film kind of plays it up, because the film, the way the timeline works is that it feels like it's a couple of days, but perhaps this was like a month long journey to find the colonel. I mean, it certainly
Would
could
you
seem
say
that
40
way.
days? Yeah, I don't know, and also, the only thing I don't like about the mission taking off in Rise is then it would be less of a twist to that person, right? Because by that time, aren't the apes becoming intelligent and gathering? Or
yeah,
did
I
they take off before that? I can't remember, I'd have to go back and watch it.
yeah, I mean, personally, it kind of the principle that this all leads into it, and the very premise that this is like apes starting to rise kind of spoils it. But
Mhm,
that
yeah.
is an interesting point. I guess
Yeah,
that's coming from my point of view, because even sight unseen the original film, I knew that it was like present day because I was around to see the marketing for these series of films, and so I think that in itself is just one of those things that gets spoiled over time by the own
absolutely.
films.
I mean, if not that way, then by the endless parodies, of that
Oh yeah.
film. Um, and,
Ironically, most of the greatest twists I learned from seeing parodies of them.
oh, for sure, especially, like, on The Simpsons.
Yeah,
Like, I'm sure there's a Simpsons episode, I feel like I remember one, for this one too, but, yeah, it's like it's hard to be shocked at the end, but I think somehow I think that I knew how it ended when I saw the original one, the '68 one, but it had been long enough and I hadn't really been thinking about it enough to where even though I wasn't, like, surprised at the end, it still felt fairly satisfying, but yeah, especially with these movies too, it's like, I don't think anybody can be surprised by that ending anymore. Um,
I guess
yeah.
that's kind of good in a way, uh, because it forces them to look at how it all leads up to the twist. Whether the
Yes.
rest of the movie kind of supports that.
Mhm.
So although like you know I didn't have the opportunity to have that shock value, it did enable me to like, okay, how does the rest of the movie kind of build up to that? Does it support it? Is it coming right out of nowhere? I think it does. They certainly kind of don't. They certainly mislead you in that film by tricking you into thinking that this is some alternate planet or something
Yes. Yeah.
that they're on.
Very
Uh,
true.
but I guess back to this one, I wanted to mention the Bad Ape character
Oh,
for a
yes, I
moment.
love him. Steve
I
Zahn.
I find it interesting that they have the Bad Ape character who it be the most articulate out of all the apes. Even Caesar, I think he has more lines than even Caesar, or if not more lines, he certainly can put sentences together and speaks more often than he does.
I
Uh,
love this edition of this character, and I had read that people asked about in the first one, like, are there some apes that, have learned how to speak and are not maybe necessarily part of this crew, are in different parts of the world? And this sort of answers that question. And I think that Bad Ape is more articulate because he's been around humans more. He
yeah, I think
says
they
that he listens, and that's how he learned English.
Yeah, and I think that's also how he got his name. The humans call him Bad Ape, Bad Ape. He eventually believes that's his name, which is
Yeah, so
actually kind of
sad.
tragic when you think about it. But it kind of makes it that much important that he turns out to be the comedic relief of the film.
Right, and,
Eh,
like,
eh, eh,
he oh, go
yeah.
ahead, sorry.
Oh, um, I just think that the fact that he's like comedic relief doesn't really take away from any of the somber stuff in that film, because this film gets dark. Like,
Oh, for sure.
the scene before Caesar gets captured, where he's like walking by all these. I called them ape scarecrows, but they got all these dead or near dead apes hanging on these wooden crosses in the freezing cold. Just like, that's horrifying.
Mhm.
And of course, all the seeing what this virus is doing to humanity, they don't shy away from that either. The men that they encounter on the road that are shot, I think that is kind of grisly for this kind of film. But I like how Bad Ape comes into play by like being this comedic relief, and the fact that his name comes from a place of mockery just shows an unspoken amount of character to this ape. That even though he may be mocked, he may knew he was being mocked. He may not have realized he was being mocked, but he's the comedic relief nonetheless. And I think there's something important by that notion.
Yeah, I think, the choice to cast Steve Zahn, who is predominantly in funny stuff, or in, like, kinda quirky stuff, like, I specifically remember him from Joyride. That's not a great movie or anything, but it's just what I remember him the
Yeah,
most from. But,
yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that the Bad Ape character, I think, is more articulate because Caesar, like, he was treated like an ape. And I think when he's taught words, it's like giving him one word at a time very slowly. And then he's distant from humans, and most of the apes don't, or the apes at this point don't speak, just he speaks. So he doesn't really get a lot of chance to like use words, um, only when he's addressing humans. But Bad Ape has sort of been in the shadows. He learns from listening to them, but he's not like being taught by them. So he speaks the way they do, and he's also like the first ape to like wear clothes too, because he wears
Yeah,
like a full set of clothes, again because he's mimicking humans. He's not around apes, he's around humans, so he's doing what they're doing. And yet it makes sense, like when you think about how, I don't know, it makes me feel bad for animals actually in general, because it's like he latches onto the words bad ape as his name because they call him that. And I'm like, oh, it makes me think about like my pets. Like if I say no to them too much, do they think their nickname is no?
yeah,
But yeah, I think he's such a, I don't know, he has some really poignant scenes where, I don't know, I just get really sad when he's on screen sometimes, but then other times he's very funny, like you said.
yeah. It's interesting that you bring up the no, no, no thing because that's what he says a lot to Nova. You know, don't touch
Oh
that. No,
yeah.
no, no, no. uh, Kind of interesting. And of course, that kind of is the start of him kind of annoying Maurice to the point where Maurice gets up and growls or yells at him in a humorous moment. Uh, it's kind of like this building up to this punchline that you don't even realize is coming. But if you look at like where it's set up, it's there all along. You can see in wide shots. Maurice kind of be like, "Really, dude, what are you doing?" to that ape. I think the relationship to all these apes is kind of interesting. The dynamic that they have. Of course,
Mhm.
some of them have known each other since the very beginning of this whole story. But when you add new characters, it's interesting to see how the group functions. The more that you add to it.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, exactly. And also the cost of Caesar's agenda and decisions, I think, too, in the film.
yes.
Because, his actions lead directly towards a lot of the stuff that happens. He separates from the main group to go on this quest for revenge, and he takes some people with him. It results in Luca getting killed. And then towards the end of the film, he finds out all of his people are rounded up again and they're in the encampment. So, in a way, this stuff all relates to actions that he took. They have a really big impact on everybody else.
Yeah. So generally, this film was kind of like widely well received.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
little people disliked it. But I did some reading, and a lot of people didn't like the basis of the story, and that it's Caesar going out for revenge is like the stupidest thing ever. And I kind of reject that criticism a little bit because if you're actually watching the movie, his viewpoint is really justified. I mean, did you see the corpses of his wife and son? Did you see? Were you watching this? Like, I don't mean to be rude, but like you watch this film, you sit and pay attention, you are instantly in his point of view. You're in his shoes or feet. I don't think he wears shoes, but I digress. But it really does make you feel for this guy, and the fact that he is someone who his affinity for humans is hanging by a thread, that anything can set him off, that it's done in that specific way, where you see the 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 wife, and who, by the way, I actually didn't know this before looking it up, but the actress who plays Cornelia, his wife, is Judy Greer. I
Yeah,
did
I
not
didn't
know
realize
that.
that either.
Uh, but anyway, short role, but I think she did really well.
Mhm.
Anyway, the the character journey of someone who grew up with humans, and so kind of has this insider point of view, this point of view that someone who may not have had such a positive relationship with humans might have. To see him get to this point where even he himself is questioning his better half, of like, he spares the soldiers, despite the fact that these soldiers, the fact that he spares them comes back to bite him in the end.
Mhm.
The fact that he gives the humans so many chances to do the right thing and doesn't. You absolutely do kind of get behind his reasoning, even though you don't want to see him go down this path that is very similar to his deceased rival. Speaks to the power of this character, that he has this kind of influence over you. I mean,
Yeah, and
this
yeah,
film
I
makes you
totally
cry
agree.
about apes a lot, and I think
It
that
does.
means something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I think too it's supposed to sort of in some ways mirror that the ultimate trajectory of the apes is that they become like what they hate because, he starts off extremely, pacifist and a peacemaker and he even took out his friend in the last film in order to pursue peace with the humans. And then all it takes is for a deep connection near him to derail that, almost like it's ingrained that this sort of propensity for violence, which I feel like is a lot in these movies about, I think human nature and, the things that we do and what motivates us ultimately end up being what motivates the apes as well, um, and why these cycles sort of keep continuing, or that's kind of how I read that part. So I think the movie doesn't work if he doesn't have that weakness where he goes for revenge, because I think that's just such a big part of the story. You have to have that part. So yeah, I would never think that that seemed silly. Like it just seems logical. That was his family that got slaughtered.
yeah. It's interesting that you bring up his lack of knowledge behind his namesake, because certain aspects of the story are kind of like the Julius Caesar story, where he's
Yeah.
betrayed by one close to him, and that may not have killed him, but it killed his loved ones, certainly.
Hmm.
Even though this isn't a direct kind of adaptation of that story, even though he does die in the end, it's kind of like a variant. He dies doing the right thing, whereas I'm not a Caesar expert. I don't know a lot about it. I know the general story. If you were to ask me for details, I couldn't tell you them. But there are aspects of that uh, figure in this character, and I thought that was an interesting choice to carry on. In a way, if you know that, it kind of makes the thing predictable, some aspects. But for me, I
Hmm.
didn't make that connection until much later after seeing the films.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I think you're definitely onto something there for sure. Um, I mean, he's a leader, and Caesar was a leader. Like, there's a lot of parallels too, besides even that scene. But I agree. Can we talk a little bit about the twist with Woody Harrelson's character?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay, sorry. I can edit all this out. um,
No
so
worries.
Woody Harrelson's character, he had this big justification for killing his son and for his cause and everything like that. And then ironically, when he torments Caesar and Nova comes and brings him water and food, she leaves the little doll behind, and I guess touching that doll ends up giving him the virus. And so when Caesar and him have that big standoff, he realizes he can't talk, and he has this really intense moment where he's trying to decide, like, am I going to shoot this guy, or not. And he ultimately decides, you know what? I'm going to let him shoot himself because I know that's what he's going to do. By his own logic, he has to die. And that's how Woody Harrelson's character ends. And I think it is freaking perfect.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Uh, this is probably the scene in the movie where I was like, okay, so the Colonel's been absent for a while. Uh, you kind of notice it as they're planning the escape. Like what you're thinking, where's the Colonel in all
Hmm.
this? So I like how they slowly build up to that, and the fact that he does pick up the doll, that he is
Yes.
short-sighted enough to miss that. It connects beautifully to the rest of the film, where humanity destroys itself. Uh, these films they connect very much to each other as they are strong individually. They all
Hmm.
are about this one theme, and they all carry over. This is kind of like the final nail in this story of humanity that even someone like the Colonel would be so short-sighted to do something like that.
Right. He was, I mean, he's probably was maybe assuming that that doll was an Apes doll or something, like not really thinking that through. And his obsession with controlling and using the apes is what made that situation even happen. If he hadn't done that, then he wouldn't have come in contact with that doll. And it's also interesting that he was able to distance himself from the disease with his own son, and still in this moment this happens. So just poetic justice for sure.
Yeah. And the best part of that moment is that you don't really know Caesar's motive. Like, is he
Hmm.
letting the guy kill himself because he doesn't want to do it? Was he intending for him to live on in this def, uh, not deformed, de-evolved state?
Yeah.
Or is it a bit of both? Did he want him to shoot himself, or was it's interesting, this unspoken motivation that lies throughout the character throughout this film, certain things that he does. Sometimes you can point out, oh, that's because of its empathy, that's his empathy talking, or that's his struggle with that empathy that's controlling him. There are certain segments in this movie where you don't know why he pulls the trigger, whether it's because he's being empathetic, whether he's losing his empathy, or maybe if it's a bit of both.
Yeah, I almost felt in that scene like part of it could be this is the ultimate way he shows he really is better than him, because he has this moment for sweet revenge and he's like, actually, the best revenge is to not do this. you know? So
Yeah.
it's like you said, it could really go either way. Or is it like, I'm not like you, I'm empathetic, like you're saying? Like it could be so many different things. Maybe it's a little bit of all those things. Yeah, I think it's just such a great it's just such a great ending for that villain too. So just all of that I just really enjoy.
Yeah, and the colonel seems to like want him to kill him in the end. He seems to like, I don't know if those were the exact motions that he was doing, but it seemed to me like he was wanting that kind of release, but that he doesn't do it.
Yeah,
You could make the argument that if he did it, he was acting out of mercy, but that they don't do that
true.
kind of speaks to this dual motivation behind the character that is
I
kind
think
of
for sure.
seen
Oh,
throughout the
sorry.
film. No, go
Yes.
ahead.
I think Woody Harrelson wanted to die as what he considered a human. Um and if he goads Caesar into killing him, he gets to have that. But by Caesar not pulling the trigger, then he has to kill himself before he's quote unquote not human by his own standards, you know?
Yeah, and you see kind of like the reaction that he has to it. He's just like he's not surprised by it, but he's also like, wow, like when it comes to this guy, all talk and no show for it. He's just like all the others, until the very end.
Mhm.
He can be the most strong, most disciplined guy, but yet still, you know, regress not only physically but like emotionally, mentally too. And maybe
Yeah.
that could be the virus talking, but I like to think that's the character itself, his own regression, not by anything the virus is doing to him, but his own doing.
Yeah, and also sort of an acknowledgement like, "Hey, we lost." Like, in general. I mean, if he has it, then everyone around him is going to have it too. And maybe he also doesn't want to stick around and see that, you know?
Yeah, and he talks a lot about what will happen when it does become, Planet of the Apes. He doesn't want to be around to where the roles are reversed.
Exactly.
Although when you look at these films as a whole, they kind of do reflect a circle of life
Hmm.
scenario where the apes come into being, or they come into their intelligence. Humanity doesn't believe them. They try to wipe them out, but the apes ultimately prevail. And then you go to the 68 film where it's like the apes are supreme, the humans come back, and the same thing plays out, but it's basically in reverse. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
Although you don't see that kind of same scenario for the humans as you do for the apes in these movies.
I guess every species that has the upper hand in this cycle, ultimately, their belief that the other species is below them is what plays directly into their downfall, whether that be the humans or the apes.
Yeah, and that kind of it's a lot of little things throughout this film that I kind of why I love it so much. You
Yeah.
can see in all areas of the characters, how they interact with each other, the story, how that connects to the characters, and even like background things that you wouldn't even notice. Like it could be like a CG artist doing something with one of the characters, animate them or in a specific way, uh, or even the actors themselves, their motions. They feel very human. They feel very like us. Just the many ways that they get us to root for these characters, I think, is the ultimate surprise of this film. That you'd be so caring about someone who you kind of see yourself in, but are definitely like a fictionalized version of that. Uh,
Yeah. And it
I just,
ends on a happy note, at least for the apes. They reach the promised land, which looks a lot like the 1968 film, like the setting being a desert and stuff. It kind of looks more like what we see in that film, and that's where they're like safe. And of course, Caesar doesn't make it to the promised land. He doesn't. He's dying, and he doesn't tell any of the other apes that he's mortally wounded. But I think him dying sort of plays into like the whole like mystifying his existence towards the end, because his ultimate goal was to get his people to safety. He achieves that, but by dying he becomes an even more like mythical religious type figure.
yeah, and the impact that he has on the apes is definitely felt,
Mhm.
considering that the last line, or I guess second to last line, is like, your son will know who was his father and what Caesar did and what he means for all of us. Kind of the legacy that is instilled in the final moments of this character and film overall is kind of like reflects like the real life situation of like this character very much is had had a great impact on me, at least in the way I got to invest with him
Yeah, that's a
emotionally.
really good point.
Yeah, it's like the filmmaker is speaking through the characters in a way, and I guess
Yeah.
that's true of all films. The way the dialogue is, they come up with it. And so, although the actors say it, it's basically the filmmaker saying it to you, which is another
Mhm.
way, funny
Good
way of looking
point.
at it. And if I may,
Yeah.
um, I know this is slightly coming to spoilers for other films, but can I mention how three films from 2017 had similar endings for their long-running characters?
Yes,
You
go
had
for it.
this, you had The Last Jedi, and you had Logan. And if you, without getting too much into it, the way all three of those characters, so you have Caesar, you have Luke, you have Logan from that film. They kind of follow similar journeys. I found that kind of funny. Maybe I wouldn't have thought of that
Oh.
if I hadn't seen those films recently, but I did kind of find it funny that, in the same year in 2017, we lost three popular characters, all in similar ways, doing similarly heroic things. You know, I
Man,
guess
that's a
the
really good
Logan
point.
connection makes sense because it's both films were by Fox, but the others by
Mhm.
Disney. Wait, hold on. and then the year later Disney bought Fox. Maybe this all was just the Disney involvement was all longer before it became public.
Well, I've
Conspiracy
never
theory
thought of
time.
that, but I do think that in movie years, it feels like there's like a tone, like a collective consciousness theme. Like, you know how for a while, like every movie had that beam coming out of the sky, destroying everything? It
Yeah,
feels a little like that was just like in the collective consciousness somehow and found its way into these really popular films. But I agree, there's definitely a connection there.
it's like
Um,
the back in the '90s when they had Armageddon and Deep Impact, and they're very much about the
yeah,
same things.
yes, very much so. Man, that's I'm gonna be thinking about that now. That's so true.
I apologize. I
Yeah.
probably may have ruined that for some.
No, no, I don't think so. I feel like there's been enough time. Um,
Yeah.
Also, it's when Maurice finally speaks, and I think he's sort of taking on the baton from Caesar, and it shows the evolution of the apes too, because I feel like, you know, for a long time Caesar was talking, the other apes were not, except for Bad Ape. But as he's dying, he speaks to him in using human language, and it sort of implies that he's gonna not only teach everybody about Caesar and where he came from, but also teach them to speak. It feels like that's the next step for them.
Yeah, and just that the way that they wrap it up, it's a sad ending for the guy. Don't get me wrong, but it's like happy tears. You're happy to see
Hmm.
that this is where he ends. Considering everything that's come before, it just feels so right that he be that his journey would end here. Although in a way, his journey lives on, through those
Right.
around him. Like the real Caesar, I guess, in a way. He lives on through the people that he interacted with. Although I don't know, again, I don't know much about Julius Caesar, but I'm sure that this fictional Caesar probably lives on in a lot more positive light. Uh, just that he inspired through his heroism and acts of selflessness. And the strongest part is that he overcame. And in the end, he overcame. He openly admitted his struggle with his own humanity and morality, but he came through in the end. And I think that's
Hmm.
the real strength of this character is that he represents us through those moral struggles that we have. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe I'm
No,
reaching too
I
much, but
agree. He represents the better parts of us. He's a
yeah,
hero.
he's a very much aspirational figure there.
Mhm. Well, did we miss any other scenes that you still wanted to cover?
Um, I guess just like uh, throw out of some of my favorite Andy Circus moments. Like he
Sure.
really like knocked it out of the park with this movie. It's like every scene he's in is like golden. But one of the earlier scenes in the film where he confronts the traitor ape, I think his name was Winter, and
Mhm.
he slowly reveals unto him like what the ape did by turning his back on people, like my wife, my son are dead. Just that intensity that he
Yes.
has, and yet he doesn't. He's very much reserved in it. He's not like yelling at. Of course, he can't yell because people are nearby, but that he keeps it in just makes it even more intense. I think if
Mhm.
he were to be very open and yell outright about his anger,
Yeah, his
I guess
self-control
yeah,
it makes it scarier somehow.
yeah, and Circus in this film, he has these moments where his character's emotions like flip instantly. Like
Yes.
he's despondent over the loss of his wife and son, and so he hears something, he's going into action. He's got this feral anger about him, and then he sees his son, and he ultimately just breaks down. Uh,
Mhm.
and the transition is so believable. And you have a similar moment where uh, he saves the child apes in the camp, and then after everything is safe, he slowly, turns his head back to the colonel's quarters, and his emotions flip instantly. Just that change that he's so versatile is the reason why I love him as an actor so much, and I think he's very much underrated. I know,
So
like for
true.
some, like motion capture acting is kind of like in a category of itself. But I looked at this film and I thought, like, No, everyone who is doing motion capture here is very much acting. You can see
Mhm.
the actor behind the role, even though it's all computer generated. The character is computer generated. Uh, the CG would be nothing without the actor to act that out for the film. I
Right, if
think if you
anything,
just
it's
try
more
to,
impressive.
yeah, if you just try to insert it, it would seem cheap. It would seem false. It would
Yeah.
seem like it wasn't being genuine enough. That you do have these actors, these very talented actors, behind these characters. Some of whom this may have been their first time, being in the motion capture scene. Others who are very experienced. That they have this kind of love of the form of acting, despite the kind of mixed reception it may get from people, is just so special to me that you kind of see that passion for all forms of acting. It actually makes me wish he did get like some form of recognition that year for his character. Uh,
Seriously.
I mean, I don't put much stock into awards anyway, considering like almost all the time they get something wrong. And so every year it's like,
Mhm.
this. But I don't know, like Andy Serkis, considering the amount of experience he has behind him and the amount of talent that he's proven, like I think something like an Academy Award or something would have been fully warranted for his work here, especially since his character perishes, and so I'm told the Academy really loves that stuff. When the
Right.
major character hangs up the role and dies. I hear
Uh-huh.
that gives them a lot of credit, but I guess that only applies to certain cases here,
Yeah,
which is kind of
it
sad.
feels
But
like
yeah,
with sci-fi or fantasy, the Academy has always really struggled to recognize, those types of movies the way that the general audience does. Um, I feel like that's starting to change a little bit, but not by much.
yeah. I mean that this trilogy of films only ever really got a VFX nod for this
Mhm.
entire run is kind of sad. In fact,
It
it kind of
is.
misses the point of what these films are about. They're very much about what is underneath and not what is immediately presented. Um, it just, I don't know, disappointing. And it did,
I
I
totally
mean,
agree.
I guess Blade Runner, the 2049 film came out the same year, and so that got a lot of technical nods, which I don't know. I wouldn't take anything away from that, but it's kind of frustrating whenever you have those two great films come out in the same year as each other. It's like, man, if there'd been any other year, I'm sure to nailed it. But I guess in-house competition ultimately is what plays into it, I guess.
Well, and it's similar to that movie in that it's not really a big crowd pleaser either. It's like these 2 incredibly well-made, amazing films that they don't really bring huge box office revenue, and that's kind of
Yeah,
unfortunate, but just the nature of, I think, the genre that they're in. It's just not for everybody, so it's kind of like they're the
yeah,
absolute best at what they do, but, not everybody likes those kind of films.
yeah. I mean, this didn't bomb. I think it made like
Oh,
400
yeah, I think it
million,
did better
but
than Blade Runner,
after
but
after Dawn, which I think made 700 million when it came out for its theatrical run, that kind of noticeable decline. It's not a
Mhm.
small amount less. It's like such a wide decline. It's kind of sad. Although I blame like the release date of the film. It came out a
Oh.
week after Spider-Man: Homecoming, and it came out a week before Dunkirk. And
Oh,
those two
yeah.
films have very similar audiences. Not to mention, you had
Yes.
Transformers before, and all these. Sometimes I wish they released these tentpole films further apart from each other. That way,
Agreed.
they seem more special and more like event films.
Mhm.
And it
Because you're right,
also would
people have
give,
to make decisions with their money, and it's understandable.
yeah, and it also give an opportunity for general audiences to see them more as just like, oh, thrill of the week type experiences.
Mhm.
To have that time to go back and really appreciate them. Similar to like back in the good old days with like Jaws and Star Wars, where they came out and were really the only thing of their kind, for the entire run. They played months on end, and everyone got back to see them again, not only because it was the only thing really out that was popular, but also because they were great. And they were great because people saw it multiple times and appreciated something new about them each time. Almost wish we'd go back to
Mhm.
that. I guess we kind of are because, like, with Tenet and films like that playing, for a long amount of times because of all these delays. But I hope when things do go back to some semblance of normalcy, that these kind of blockbuster films are more spaced out. But I guess we'd have to get past the whole, the wave of delays and then the wave of new stuff in order for that to be implemented. But I think that'd be a fun experiment for people to try. I probably went on a tangent there, but
No, you're
it just
fine.
made
That's
me
what we do
it,
on
it
this show.
made me realize that something.
I
It
agree.
made me
I
realize
I
that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think I misspoke at the top of this podcast. I already had my podcast going, I believe, by the time this movie came out. So I would have been seeing a lot of films in theaters. So like it's weird that I didn't remember that, but I think it could be because it was such a huge year. I wasn't thinking about it being released at the same time or the same year as like Blade Runner and Spider-Man Homecoming and so that speaks to your point. I do wish they were a little bit more spread out. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think if it had come out like maybe a few weeks later, like after they had had their time to run, that probably would have worked out better for the films. But as
Mhm.
is, I mean, we still got a great film,
Yeah.
regardless. But I guess it was just the timing of all that affected its box office performance.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes total sense. Um, well, this brings me to my last couple of questions then. The first question being, why do you like this movie so much if you had to summarize it? Like, why do you feel you've seen it so many times?
I guess I've seen it so many times because I enjoy the films that go the halfway between seeming real and seeming like fantasy.
Mhm.
It's like a pendulum swing. Too much
Yeah.
into reality, and you're basically watching reality itself. Too much into fantasy, and you don't have any grasp on reality or something that feels tangible, that feels connected to our world. What this film does is it hits the midpoint where it's like a hybrid of fiction and reality, where it gets you to think about real world things through fantasy means, talking apes obviously being the fantasy element in there, but that you see these battle of morals and a battle of wits and all these intense, very human emotions being felt throughout the film, in the confines of the story of apes versus man, which itself has, I guess, basis in reality. Uh, Somewhat, I guess. Apes being seen as like the closest thing to man as man is,
Mhm.
and that you kind of have that throughout the film consistently, is probably my biggest draw. The other is probably the screenwriting. I'm kind of like in this phase where I'm wanting to go into screenwriting. I'm currently in college where I'm learning to do more film production type things. And what I'm hoping to accomplish is do something like what this film does, where everything sort of connects to each other. It's not complicated, but if you're looking for those details, you'll find them. That you can enjoy this on a surface level, somewhat surface level. It does require you to think about the ethics of these characters, but that you're able to enjoy it and then go back to it and kind of see how it all connects in the end. It's not like a franchise sprawling thing like the Marvel movies are and some of these other big name franchises. It's very much in its own space, but that you're able to see this as its own thing with so many details that pertain to character, that pertain to story and action and effects and just the visual style, the way it's presented, are all appealing factors to me. I appreciate whenever a filmmaker comes along and wants to try something different. As I said in the opening, this is pretty much how I view it as the anti-blockbuster. Not that I dislike blockbusters. I'm like everyone else. I enjoy a good, superhero movie and what have you. But that this challenges people to think a little deeper about themselves, while being able to present a lot of this fantasy action that gets you caught up, but only gets you caught up because you feel so much for these characters and because you're invested. It's not something like, Transformers and things like that, where you're a slave to the action. You're not feeling anything because you're not invested in anything. That these films connect so so much to humans and human emotions, and then proceed to tell this great tale of loss, of grief, of morality, of ethics, of war, of man versus nature, of nature versus nurture, ideas like that. It's so layered. It's very
Mhm.
much like one of those films that you can go back and rewatch and always find something new to appreciate about it. And I know you probably wanted something simple,
No,
but
that's
that's kind
okay.
of like my
It's
how
not a
I feel
simple
about
film.
it.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
not a simple franchise. I think you're I mean, I don't even have anything to add to that. I think that's absolutely everything you said is so true. I am not, looking into screenwriting necessarily, but I sympathize with the fact that I gravitate towards stories like this where it's got a lot of layers and where it all connects and every little detail is sort of wrapped up, and everything that's introduced is, has a conclusion, and the themes in this story I really I mean I just when I pick different, they tend to be science fiction or
Yeah.
stories like this. I gravitate towards them about questions about what makes us human, why are we here, what about us is inevitable, what can we change, what can be made better, what will be worse. All that stuff is fascinating, and I think when it's in the science fiction or fantasy genre we have a little bit of distance and we're better able to really dissect these themes without them feeling a little too close to home, which is kind of something you had touched on earlier as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think this trilogy is underrated. I think, like you said, it did well, but maybe not as well as it could have or should have, for a variety of reasons that we've kind of talked about. But if you haven't ever thought about, watching this, I think you really need to give it. I'm leading into my next question already here, but my pitch, I guess, is that if you've kind of stayed on the sidelines and thought, well, I didn't really like the first Planet of the Apes films, or I didn't see it, so I'm just not interested. I think this series surprises you. It's got a lot of layers. It's very nuanced. It takes the things from the 60s version, which already had some really interesting themes it explored, and it just expands upon them like times 10. And so I think you should definitely check it out, even if you're not like a huge um I don't know, science fiction person. It's not like you said, it's a little more grounded than some science fiction stories are. It might not be what they're expecting. What do you think your pitch would be? I'm just going on and
I
on
guess
here.
no worries. I like these kind of discussions because it makes you think a lot. But I guess my kind of elevator pitch, if I was talking to somebody in an elevator about this, it's a sequel, so it's kind of like you already got that credibility to it. But
Mhm.
do you want to see a film where you can be inspired and yet also shown a mirror of yourself and of people around you? Do you want to see action and great effects and a lot of visual storytelling, but also want some of the lighthearted humor? That's kind of like my pitch. Is it just a series of questions? And I
Mhm.
guess to add to my my thought a little bit is one last thing about this film. It inspires you to change. And I think that is what is essential to its success. It doesn't say, hey, humans, you suck. What you're currently doing is, not right, and leave it at that. It's easy to point out a problem. It's harder to give a solution and be like, hey, you've made mistakes in the past and you may be still making mistakes. But here's how you can do better,
Mhm.
and the way that the film shows doing better as being more empathetic to people, to that about being human is not about your intelligence or your physical standing, but your empathy and what lies within your character,
Yeah,
is
very
what
good point.
matters most.
Wow, I love that. Love it. Well, Dallin, where can people find you?
So I run a blog called Dallin the Film Fanatic. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, at Dallin the Film Fanatic for all of them, or I think at D the Film Fanatic for Twitter. You can find my work on my personal accounts. You just search Dallin Curtis. You can find it there. Um, I pretty much repost my stuff there. So if you find it there, you find it there. I do like movie reviews. I do rankings from time to time. Admittedly, I'm not as active as I once was because I'm doing school and other things going on in my life. But I do come back and write up a new post whenever I see a movie that I really enjoy and I want to share my enthusiasm about. So follow me there. If you appreciate film like me or even if you don't appreciate film like me, I think I'd love to hear your kind of response to what I'm doing, and it, just opening up ways for discussion would be interesting. Uh, I love having talks with people about film, and so that's a great place for it too. So yeah, you can find me there if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and you're gonna have to think about the next film that you want to bring back. You should definitely come back.
Oh yeah, when you approached me about this, I was like, oh, so many good ones come to mind. So yeah, definitely have to come back. I
Awesome.
didn't do like a big. I know in my mind, I was like, I'm not going to do like one of my favorite film. Yet I think that would be a first one. But as we're talking about this, maybe this is one of my favorite films. I don't know. I have such a
It's hard to
passion
narrow them
for
down
this one.
sometimes.
It feels like I have 50 sometimes.
Yes,
So
I agree. I sympathize with that for sure. Well, look forward. Thank you so much for coming on, and look forward to having you back. Have a good one.
you too.